Okay, Michael.
You appeared.
All right. Well, let's keep going here. I think now we can finally, after all these preliminary comments, we can roll up our sleeves and get started. So as I said before, the concern of natural philosophy is being as material, meaning changing. And so here we're going to talk about what I would say, what I would call the facts of change. So if we look around, we sense change all the time. Ice melts. Bless you. I get sunburned. The acorn becomes an oak tree. The meat in the hamburger becomes part of you. The armadillo dies on the road, becomes a carcass. You have a great insight. So all these seem to be examples of change, and it seems that it's an important feature of the world around us, that it's a changing world, that it's everything changes and seemingly changes all the time, and it seems to be undeniable. But along with the facts of change, there is what's called the problem of change, or the paradox of change. And that was recognized before Aristotle, as we will see in a moment, quite a bit before Aristotle. I mean, immediately as soon as the Greek philosophers started to reflect on the world around them, they were confronted with a paradox of change. One way to illustrate it, I take that example from the book by Father Michael Dodds that I mentioned, last time. So imagine a bucket of ice, and then the ice melts, and you get a gallon of water. Okay, we consider that to be a change, but we don't consider, dumping the ice somewhere and then filling the bucket with a gallon of water. We don't consider that to be a change, even though the end result seems to be the same. You start off with ice, you get a gallon of water, and the water is, let's say that for all practical purposes, it's indistinguishable. We don't view the second operation as a change. And the reason we don't is because even though there's a change, at the same time, there seems to be a continuity or a need. There's something in change that involves continuity. And that seems a little bit paradoxical, because we think of change, we tend to focus on the new stuff, but the new stuff by itself is not a change unless there is a continuity in the change. And so here we again appeal with our to our principles of intelligibility that I mentioned in I think the first lesson. Because we want to have some there's a dynamism here, right? There's a change, but we want to appeal to an explanation for that change. We can't just say that, boom, it just happens the way a rabbit would come out of a hat, right? So we want to anchor our understanding of this process into something that we think is real. So we think that there's a real continuity in the change. Okay. So ice becoming water is one kind of change that we have to explain. So what is the continuity? I'm going to ask you to put aside our current notion, because our current notion is going to say, oh, of course, the molecules are the same, right? So the molecules have remained, so that's what this is continuing through the change, but they're just, their motion now is different, and that's why we have ice. So set that aside for the time being. Put yourself in the shoes of, an inhabitant of a Greek island, 3,000 years ago, and reflect on these things. There's, so you have to make to develop an understanding of what's happened here. And what may be even more striking in the problem of change is when you have the armadillo that is there, and then it gets hit by a car, and then you have a carcass, and we think of that as a change as well, even though we have in a way a completely different thing, because we may point to the carcass and say that's an armadillo, but in fact that's really not an armadillo, because a carcass is really a different thing altogether. An armadillo is a living organism, and it sniffs around, and it reproduces, and it munches on shrubs or whatever. But a carcass is just matter that is going to be decomposing and so forth. But here again, there has to be a continuity in the change, because we sense this as a change. It's not that all of a sudden the armadillo has vanished out of existence and poof, the carcass has come into existence out of nowhere, right? There has to be a continuity that we want to explain. So that's really the problem of change. And prior to Aristotle, faced with this paradox, there were two schools of thought that we attribute, two ideas. One, we attribute one to Heraclitus and one to Parmenides. And Heraclitus was of the notion that really, because everything changes all the time, nothing really is. He's famous for saying, you cannot step in the same river twice. And why? Because it's different water, and therefore, since the water is different, it's no longer the same river, and nothing is. So, I'm my hair is grayer now than it was 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Therefore, I'm not the same person. I'm not. It changes all the time. Our molecules are we're exchanging our material being with the rest. Nothing changes. Therefore, everything changes and nothing is. Okay, so that was Heraclitus' solution to this problem, was that identity is an illusion, that everything is actually just a change. And then there was the opposite viewpoint, which we attribute to Parmenides, again an ancient predecessor of Aristotle, who on the contrary said that no, change does not exist, that change is an illusion. What we get from our senses is an illusion, because he adopted a very logical perspective. He said, whatever being there is, there only two possibilities are open. If you have a being, either it came to be from being this, right? So if you have a carcass, it came to be from being a carcass, from being this, in which case there's no change, because from being to being, there's no change. Okay, so change does not exist. Or it came to be from non-being this, and that's impossible, because nothing comes from non-being. Non-being can't even be conceived of, and therefore nothing comes to be from non-being, and therefore change does not exist, and it's an illusion. So these two opposite viewpoints at the end of the spectrum seem to be logically viable, but neither of them seem to be consistent with our most basic fundamental public experience. What I said as public experience, meaning we have a sense understanding that the word change, and that things do have an identity, that there's persistence through change. That, for example, our own, remember when I said that with the Aristotelian philosophy we start with our own basic sense experience. So we have a sense of ourselves as persisting, as having an identity, right? I mean, there is a meaning to the word I am. Okay, the word I am. So we sense ourselves as being an identity. We don't sense ourselves as being constantly, a different thing. Okay, and so these two positions are in conflict with our fundamental assumptions of intelligibility. They render the word unintelligible, because Parmenides will say our our sense experience is completely illusory, right? It's an illusion, or we shouldn't rely on it, and so forth. Nothing changes. Everything is one. So he was appealing to the one, that the world was. These ancient philosophers, unfortunately, we only have very fragments that remain of them, and however they express themselves was very either poetic or obscure or occultish in a way. But the bottom line is that whether it's Parmenides or Heraclitus, they jar our sense of intelligibility of the world. Okay, because then Heraclitus will say there's no identity. Everything is just a succession of different things. Okay, and nothing is the same thing. Okay, and therefore the question that the notion of change is challenged, and we cannot make sense of it. And basically, to simplify things, Aristotle comes on the scene and solves that problem, and he solves that problem by agreeing with Parmenides that yes, nothing can come from non-being. So Parmenides is right, nothing comes from non-being, but there are two modes of being. There is being in potency and being in act. Okay, being in potency and being in act. So nothing comes from non-being. Agree with Parmenides. Two modes of being in act and being in potency. And being in potency is sort of, if you will, a middle ground between non-being and being in act. Okay, and potency, if you will, is a capacity for possessing an actuality one does not yet possess but can acquire. And therefore, the ice is in potency to becoming water, right? It's not water in act, because if it were water in act, there would be no change. You would go from water to water, okay? It is not non-being. It's not complete non-being. It's being in potency to water, okay? The armadillo is not a carcass, but it's in potency to becoming a carcass, okay? So there is that mode of being in potency that we invoke now to render the world intelligible, and to solve that tension between the position that change does not exist or the position that everything changes and therefore nothing is. Okay, so that's really the fundamental contribution. And what we're going to do for the next few videos is really explore and develop this notion of act and potency, and highlight the principles and understand what that means. So the question of potency and act is best defined first by giving examples, which I just did. The ice is in act as ice and is in potency to becoming water. I am in potency to becoming sunburned, okay? And then I spend 2 hours in the sun and I'm sunburned in act, okay? The armadillo is in potency to becoming a carcass, okay? And note here that all these, we have the word is. So just to highlight that we're really talking about modes of being, okay? To be in potency, being in potency, or being in act, okay? And potency and act are here, what's important in this Aristotelian perspective is that they are real features in the things themselves, okay? So being in potency is not just the observer making a statement about the thing. The ice itself is really itself in potency to becoming water, okay? And it's really, and then when it becomes water, it really becomes water in act, okay? And of course, we know that being in potency is specific, because the water is not in potency to becoming an armadillo or to becoming gold. I mean, let's say the bucket of ice is not in potency to becoming a brick of gold, right? But it's in potency to becoming water, okay? So being in potency is a feature of the ice itself, okay? It's out there in the world. It's not just my mind constructing a certain explanation. It's there in the world, itself. They're real features of the world and in the things themselves. So potency and acts are real features in the things themselves, not simply in the mind of the observer. For example, a lump of clay is in potency to becoming a statue, but a gallon of water is not in potency to becoming a statue. Okay? So potency and act are really fundamental and mutually connected principles, and they really cannot be defined separately. If I try to define what being in potency means, I can only define what being in potency as distinct from what being in act, in actuality means. And likewise, when I define what being in act means, I can only define what being, to distinguish it from being in potency. So it's a very, very fundamental philosophical principle. And, or these are two fundamental philosophical principles. And really, we can only convey them, and Aristotle could only convey them by just giving these kinds of examples, okay? By saying, if we're going to hang on to our principles, our assumptions that the world is intelligible, we have to invoke these two modes of being, okay? So really, that's the fundamental Aristotelian insight, that if we're going to hang on to the principles of intelligibility, we have to invoke these two modes of being. And if we don't invoke those two modes of being, then the world ceases to be intelligible, right? Either it's going to be that everything changes, and then the experience of being, which we all have, which is our public experience, which we sense ourselves as being sort of a thing, a whole unity, this, goes away. Yeah, and on the other hand, if we only hang on to this sense of being and we don't invoke being in potency to something else, then the question of changes, goes away, and then our sense. So potency and act are really the foundations of Aristotelian natural philosophy, and here we have them. And what we'll do next time is we'll bring in a more specific vocabulary about matter and form, with matter being the name that we use to point to the principle of potency, and form being the name that we use to point to the principle of being in act. So matter is what makes something be in potency to becoming something else, and form is what makes something in act to being what it is, okay? So I'm going to stop here, and I just want to let tell you that this is not the end of this. We're going to get into this topic over and over again for the next few lessons, because it's kind of, in a way, it has a familiarity, but at the same time, it's kind of foreign to what we're used to thinking, and that's why it's dangerous to think that we understand it so quickly when we don't. We may have an intuitive understanding of it because the world is intelligible, and because we sense that the world works that way. But to articulate it is important, because then we can distinguish this way of understanding the world around us from alternative ways of understanding the world around us. Okay, I think that's all I have to say here, and I'm going to see if you have any comments here, or if you wanted to wait for further lessons.
That was a nice lecture. I mean, especially when the potency and act got connected to matter and form.
Okay.
It felt like some important stuff was coming together there for me. So.
Okay.
So that was good. I was also thinking in the relation to the paradox of change that it seemed linked to the question of whether the universe is discrete or continuous.
Yes, definitely. We'll see that when we talk about the challenge of Zeno and the paradox of Zeno. Zeno was a follower of Parmenides, and so the question of continuity is important, and we'll definitely get into it at some point, quite deeply in the course, about the continuity of the universe and how to understand that.
Well, I've been intrigued recently by Stephen Wolfram's claim that the universe is discrete.
Yeah, we'll have to define exactly what is meant by discrete. And so the important concept here, when we'll get into it down the line, is going to be quite a bit further down the line, is the question of void. So is there void or is that not void? And so for Aristotle, there was no void. And we'll have, but we'll need to, we'll need to get there in due time. We can't just, address that question immediately.
Well, but it looks interesting. So.
Okay, very good. Then we'll leave it at that, because again, we'll have a chance to rehash what we just said in this lesson over and over again.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, you're welcome, Michelle. We'll see you next time.
Okay.